thank you so much for being here. But thank you first for the cellist. Everyone, give it up to the cellist. Huh? Really nice. Great atmosphere. And it's such a pleasure to be here. And I want you to know from the outset that your presence here is reinforcing my faith in humanity, if only because we have this turnout on a night like this when its summer switch suddenly got flicked in New York and it's lovely out. The other reason is that the Olio guys were telling me right before I came on stage is that the number of people here tonight is double the number of people who are here for an event in this same venue at the same time yesterday, okay? Now, full disclosure, it was a monthly meeting of New Yorkers who still use Hotmail on a regular basis, but you guys deserve some credit, so I appreciate that. So, my name is Phelim Kine, and with a name like that, when you meet people for the first time, it can cause all kinds of interesting reactions. And I can't tell you how many times when I've met people and people have been disappointed that number one, I'm not female, or number two, that I'm not Asian, or this is the worst one, that I'm not an Asian female. But my parents, this is a thing I grew up with, right? And my parents, Phelim, everyone else is John and Simon and Dave, and they said, they explained, it was really good. Phelim is an extremely common boy's name in Ireland in the 18th century, okay? Now guys, I am not a comedian. This guy's a comedian. I want to introduce you to a guy by the name of Zarganar. Zarganar is a citizen of Burma, or Myanmar. And Zarganar in 2009 was sentenced to 59 years in prison for making jokes about his then authoritarian government. He got out 2 years later as a result of international pressure, and I had the pleasure to meet him shortly after here in New York. And I talked to him, I said, so you're free and your country's changing, and what are you gonna do with your routine? You going back to comedy? What's gonna happen? And he looked at me and he said, Phelim, in my country, comedy is very dangerous. And in this country, and in most liberal democracies, comedy isn't dangerous yet. Freedom of expression, the right to criticize, to make jokes about your government, isn't dangerous yet. But the reason I'm here tonight, and the reason why you came, is it's fair to say that we are at a point in history now when human rights, appreciation, respect for universal human rights, by countries that have traditionally been at the forefront, the standard bearers of universal human rights, are openly questioning, scorning, and undermining the concept of human rights. And make no mistake, that is very dangerous. It's dangerous for me, it's dangerous for you, it's dangerous for us. And it requires focus, recognition, and resistance. And that's what I want this to be tonight. So, before we get into it, we got to think about, what's at stake? What are human rights? And base gross distillation is human rights are established principles that protect us from abuses and neglect by the state, our state, various states. And this concept of universal human rights is fairly modern. You had thinkers like John Locke and Thomas Paine who used to talk about this idea of natural rights that just were natural because you're a human, and they consisted of life, liberty, and property. Now the problem was, back then, property included what? Slaves. It was embedded into it, slavery. People could be bought and sold. I'll tell you, it's a true story, 2.3 miles south of here, 1711, on Wall Street, between Pearl Street and Water Street, a slave market opened. By 1730, in this city where we live, 42% of New Yorkers were slave owners. Now, the real first mass movement in terms of recognizing and pursuing universal human rights was the abolition movement for slavery, the abolition movement for slavery. And this movement enshrined or laid the seed for this idea that by benefit of our humanity, we should be protected from certain abuses and we should have the benefit of certain rights. Now, flash forward 200 years to January 1940. Go north 53 blocks to 65th Street East, the home of the New York home, city of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The world's at war. The United States isn't yet, but Nazi fascism is overrunning Europe. Japanese fascism is taking big parts of Asia. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt wrote a speech in which he declared that this war was not just a war, but it was a fundamental battle between human slavery and human freedom. And he went further, and he said, decided, proclaimed that the only way to counter that threat was through a recognition of basic freedoms shared by all people. And that was the key idea. It was the idea of freedoms, and he kept it simple. January 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided that there were 4 freedoms, okay? And 2 of those freedoms were freedoms from something, and 2 of them were freedoms of. Can you give me a guess? Freedom of 1940, January, freedom of, what's your most important right, maybe? Freedom of expression, exactly. What else? Freedom of expression, what else? 1940, huh? Exactly, freedom of religion, freedom of worship, okay? There were 2 things that he felt people should be free from. Any ideas? No one likes to be, when I speak in front of people, I get really, freedom from fear. And what he meant by that was lots of things, but people shouldn't be held in fear at the risk of being arbitrarily detained by their government. They shouldn't be at the risk of decimation, death by weapons of mass destruction, which in the Second World War were a real threat. There's one other one that's really important. It's kind of subversive. It's kind of like a Bernie Sanders freedom. Everybody needs to, in the morning you wake up and have your freedom from, want. Yeah, freedom from want. This idea that you should be free from the pressures of not having a home, of not having enough to eat, of not having money to retire on, okay? Now, and here are, believe me, freedom from fear, freedom from want. Now, there are contradictions. There's a certain amount of contradiction or hypocrisy. Remember, it's January 1940. These are great ideas. This could be the beginning of something really great. Except there really wasn't much follow-through. In fact, there was even something that was hypocritical in terms of a recognition of these things when 2 years later, that same president and the government of the country of the United States of America decided that a certain type of person didn't deserve any rights. Who were those people? 1942 Japanese. That was the beginning. It was February 1942. It was the Japanese internment, a shameful period in history. So just flagging that this progress, which I'm trying to outline, that this progress is one of fits and starts, and it's threaded with hypocrisies and contradictions. But the good news is that from that freedom of fear, freedom from want, from these 4 freedoms, one person took those ideas and ran with them. And that person, it wasn't FDR, he was ailing, he later died. Who was it? Yeah, it was Eleanor Roosevelt. His wife took the idea of the 4 freedoms and spent the next 8 years working closely with the newly established United Nations and came up with what is really one of the most profoundly important documents that exists in modern times, because it laid the foundation for this idea of universal human rights that are embodied in law. And this thing was, I don't have a nice flash for this. It is called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, okay? What was it? Well, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was 30 articles which laid out 30 rights that people should have. So freedom, so people shouldn't be tortured. Slavery should not be allowed. People should not live in exile. People should have freedom of expression, freedom of association, a borrowing and expansion on these rights that was originally in the four freedoms. And the key issue was that it said specifically that these applied to all people, regardless of race, gender, socioeconomic status, that this is something, and it stated specifically that the reason we need that is because freedom, peace, and justice can only be achieved if there is a recognition and respect for the inherent equality and inalienable rights of all people that should be embodied in law. It was beautiful, okay? The UDHR is a beautiful thing. Problem is it's not a treaty. It didn't have the weight of international law. It was basically a expression by the General Assembly of the then freshly minted United Nations. So it didn't require the United States to begin the process of ending segregation. It didn't require the colonial powers to pull out and to free the people that they had imposed imperialism on. The other problem with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that there were dissenters at the beginning. There were 3 countries. It was unanimous in terms of the General Assembly, but there were 3 countries that abstained. They didn't vote against, but they abstained. And one of these countries is a country that I'm thinking of that often comes up in terms of challenges to human rights, particularly in the Middle East. And this country is a continual thorn in the side of people who pursue human rights. It's also got a lot of oil. Any guess? Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia abstained. Why? Any ideas? Maybe because human rights for everybody? Who would they? Women, exactly. They abstained on the basis that universal rights for women would override and violate cultural traditions in terms of how women are treated. 2 other countries abstained, and one of them was the biggest. It was a second empire at the time. At the time, you remember, it was the US, and then it was the Soviet Union. Soviet Union and Yugoslavia abstained. Why? Because they decided or proclaimed that these ideas of rights, particularly civil and political rights, speech, worship, association, in these socialist countries, authoritarian social countries, what they said is, we have a more robust and rounder view of human rights that are less about what people can say or do, but more in terms of what? Which one? Freedom from what? What became this idea of economic and social rights? So this was a division that lasted for 30 plus years. But it was 1948 that the UDHR really laid the foundation for the modern human rights movement. And the other good news from that, when we talk about progress, is that a year later, the United Nations approved something called the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions are essentially the rules of war. And both the UDHR, all of these human rights ideas and efforts were basically created in the shadow of, there's Eleanor looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, were created looking back at the horrors of World War II. The sense that, just like FDR, that there needed to be some kind of firewall that protected people from this type of brutality, that states had obligations to their people. So it was looking back, and basically we can say, it's fair to say that the human rights movement, for what it was then, the motto or slogan, you could say, boil it down to, was all about never again. It was to avoid the repetition of mass industrial slaughter that had defined that middle part of the 20th century. Now, fast forward. So this is where it's at. And for essentially this divide between the idea of political rights and economic and social rights lasted for 30 years. It wasn't until 1976 that the next big evolution in terms of rights and rights law enshrined enshrined and ratified by UN members was the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I didn't write it out because it's a long one, but it's the ICCPR. And the other one was the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. These had heft. These were different from the UDHR. These things required states, all member states of the UN, had to sign them, and they had to ratify them. And they had to integrate those rights into their own domestic law. Now, there were weaknesses from the beginning. The weaknesses of the human rights movement are essentially the same of the United Nations. It's dependent on the goodwill of member states to follow through. And so for both of these documents, you will have states that maybe have signed one, but they refuse to ratify it, which means that the integration of those rights remain in limbo. But it provided, and here's what I would say, but these things provided essentially the seedbed for the architecture of the international human rights movement. Because from these documents and from the growing awareness that they had created in terms of human rights, they created things that were designed to help put teeth in the human rights movement. And for example, we have a United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights who reports directly to the Secretary General. We have a United Nations Human Rights Council that meets in Geneva and is tasked with examining and helping to monitor the human rights performance of all nation states from A to Z, from Albania to Zambia. And from these seminal documents came other parts of this architecture, special, specific, targeted conventions on the rights of women, the rights of children, the rights of refugees, and more recently, the rights of people who are disabled. So the message is that this movement toward human rights and the support for human rights, there's been an evolution. It's come in fits and starts. It's been subject to the moral suasion. The UN doesn't really have an army, but moral suasion of the UN to get member states to honor these things. But in spite of these developments that, whether on paper or in terms of increasing the consciousness and awareness of human rights, and I would say that's another key issue, is that all of these things have been, these rights and knowledge of rights and the expansion of what rights are, how they're defined, have proven inspirational for powerless people, for people who have been under threat, who are deprived of their rights by their governments. They have been extremely inspirational in terms of trying to promote positive internal change, whether you're looking at South Africa under apartheid, or whether you're looking at now the efforts of human rights lawyers in China to try to prod the government into recognizing rights which it has signed up for in these documents. But the failure of the human rights movement, the big one, is, remember, the idea was never again. That it's kind of the litmus test really is, are you preventing mass killings on an industrial scale by abusive governments? And the fact is, that hasn't happened. And I can think of at least 4 examples from the last 40 years that are absolutely horrifyingly illustrative of that. For example, none of these things protected who? Give me a country, give me, exactly. Okay, so it didn't help. It did nothing for the Cambodians, right? It did nothing for the 800,000 people or so who were killed in 100 days in Rwanda in 1994. Who else? What else? What else do you think of? Uganda. I mean, Yugoslavia, Syria, Aleppo today. I mean, when you go through it, I mean, you start with 1965-66, when the Indonesian government launched a campaign, ruthless slaughter of so-called communists that killed trade unionists, teachers, basically cut the head off an intelligentsia that's had serious repercussions for Indonesia ever since. At the height of the Cold War, these were the calculations that states made in allowing these things to happen. Cambodia, of course, 1975 to 1979, Khmer Rouge took over and the world looked away. And like you said, Rwanda. And I don't want us to be, these are horrible things, but one of the more inspirational things is that this system and this evolving body of law and mechanisms has responded to these types of developments. Not so much in terms of this idea of never again, but ensuring, and this is the really important idea, the idea of accountability. The idea that if somebody does something, if someone abuses someone's rights, they should have to pay. The perpetrators should pay. And so what we've had in the aftermath, for example, of these events is we have something, a concept, I don't know if called universal jurisdiction, okay? Now, universal jurisdiction was actually, it's fairly old. In 1961, this is essentially what the Israelis used to prosecute Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution. And universal jurisdiction is based on the premise that any state, any court, anywhere can prosecute an individual implicated in crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, that they have the right to do that because those crimes are in a special category. Spain has been at the forefront of this movement. There's a courageous judge by the name of Baltasar Garzón in Spain who, to his credit, forced the former dictator of Chile, with the blood of many thousands of Chileans on his hands, into a very tense few weeks back in the 90s when he tried to extradite Pinochet from the United Kingdom to Spain. He failed, but it sent a ripple through the spines of other abusers and making them think twice about their travel plans. And person who comes to mind is Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger has to be really careful in terms of how he travels. He once got out of Paris just hours before he was about to be served with a summons to answer for the deaths of French citizens under Pinochet. And of course, Kissinger was an active participant in the coup that resulted in those deaths. We have another concept that's also important. The idea of, it goes down to three characters, R2P, which boils down to responsibility to protect. In the aftermath of Rwanda, this is 2005, the idea came that in urgent situations in which a government is about to commit genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, the international community can and should act through permission of the Security Council of the UN, but basically to go in and stop it, if it means military force. R2P was what led to the international intervention in Libya a few years ago. It's not used that much because it's a really, really dangerous concept, as you can see in terms of how Libya has turned out. The other institution that is really important is the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which is tasked with prosecuting internationally individuals, state members of governments, politicians who are implicated in genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Now, that was 1998. The ICC was formed in 1998, and that's no mystery because the 90s really were where the international human rights movement really hit kind of a high tide in terms of, lack of a better word, in terms of popularity, in terms of support. It was in the 90s, in the aftermath. Remember, 1989 was a big year. What happened? Berlin Wall fell. So basically the shackles of ideological constraints of the Cold War fell off somewhat. And shortly after that, what else happened? Something broke up. Much later, but of course the Soviet Union, okay? So we had this dynamic in which the traditional authoritarian superpower that opposed human rights became far less powerful. This was a time when Francis Fukuyama wrote a famous book called The End of History. And for it came 1992, I believe. And his thesis was, you can see the Berlin Wall has fallen, the Soviet Union has collapsed, Western liberal democracy has triumphed, and human rights reign supreme. Francis Fukuyama doesn't talk about that so much anymore, given how things have turned out. And we even had another example, Bill Clinton, then President Bill Clinton, standing across from China's Prime Minister Jiang Zemin and telling him, you were on the wrong side of history, that human rights are the way to go. Human rights were baked into trade agreements back then. Governments used to openly discuss these things. China was denied most favored nation status from the United States for years because of how it treated its people. The 90s were also when the international rights movement in terms of non-government organizations, and I'm talking about Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Médecins Sans Frontières, they really hit their high watermark in terms of influence. And those organizations basically hit the ground, took boots on the ground to supplement what the UN could not or would not do, which is to go to areas where gross human rights abuses are happening and to document them and to expose them. Human Rights Watch, which is my day job when I'm not at Hunter College, we have a motto or a slogan, and that is research, expose, change. And that was based on this idea that you could influence that an international organization or an individual with a bullhorn of some kind could influence an abuser, an abusing state, through what they called name and shame. This idea that if your wrongdoings are exposed, you will address those because no one wants to be exposed and shamed in the international community. In the 90s, this was not a laughable idea. In the 90s, this actually worked. Aung San Suu Kyi, the then long detained, house-arrested human rights icon of Burma, probably stayed alive for all those years because of this idea that there were eyes on her and eyes on the country. I've had the opportunity to talk to many prisoners who were student activists in the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. And one theme comes up all the time. They can point to the calendar and say, on this day, the guards stopped beating me. On this day, I got better food. Because, and you look back and you realize, that was the day that Amnesty International issued a press release. That was the day that Warren Christopher got up and said something about these people. Influence, impact, in order to have some kind of accountability. Now, where are we? So that leads us to now. It leads us not to now, but it leads us to what ended that golden era of human rights, those roaring 90s. And there were two things that did irreparable damage to the human rights movement and to the ability of both governments and international organizations to effectively advocate for human rights. The first one was the aftermath of an event that occurred in this city. 9/11, exactly. The aftermath of 9/11, which, of course, the war on terror, in which the United States implicitly, explicitly advocated for the use of torture, allowed the use of torture. Why is that so horrible? Well, it's a horrible thing, but torture as a right is probably one of the most important rights because it is so visceral. It is something that no one should have to suffer. And for the United States to allow that to happen, regardless of how they justified it legally, regardless of what they called it, enhanced interrogation, waterboarding, the fact that this was a public embrace of such a odious practice was a huge boon and bone to every authoritarian government in the world, and it allowed them to use that as a way to erode other rights. If you don't protect that most basic right, the other rights are at risk. I have sat in advocacy meetings with representatives of authoritarian governments who implicitly or explicitly say, when you say, you know, the torture of your people is a really bad thing, they'd say, well, you guys do it, as in any Western person is implicated in this type of activity. It's been hugely damaging. The other thing is something that has been slow. It's been a slow burn, but has really taken off in the last 20 years, and that has to do with this place. The rise of China as a meteoric economic power, diplomatic power. The fact that China has gone from, in the last 30 years, from a third world status country to a country in which at least the big cities are like images of a 21st century that we haven't got here yet. At least we haven't got to at Penn Station and LaGuardia Airport. And this, the fact that China has made this type of the fact that they've been able to do this has thrown into question this idea of, are civil and political rights really that important? China is a country in which there's no free media, there's no real freedom of expression, there's no freedom of worship. People who protest against the government get disappeared, end up in unlawful detention, get tortured. But it has double-digit growth, economic growth over the last 25 to 30 years. So China is now implicitly and explicitly pitching itself as a successful development model. That we have something that has been coined the Beijing Consensus, that developing countries should be able to put aside those pesky freedoms and rights like expression and worship and association, because it's more important for people to have what they call rights of subsistence and development, enough to eat, a roof over your head. You want to ask a question? Yeah, go ahead, sorry. Yeah.
Even among Westerners, it was like people who had drunk the Kool-Aid would say, well, dictatorships get shit done.
Yeah. That's a problem. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and you mentioned Singapore. You know, China. What's happening in China is basically it's this development, this acceptance of that is an outgrowth of something that in the 90s was called the idea of Asian values, and Asian values were touted by dictators like the dictator of Indonesia, Suharto, the dictator of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, the dictator of Malaysia, that Asians were fundamentally different and that they didn't really need or want individual rights because they had a much more family, communitarian idea. For me, I'll tell you, my view is that Asian values are a lot like the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman. I would say Asian values are neither Asian nor values. They are self-serving justifications for autocrats to keep abusing their people and cream at the same time. And I just want to say, it is a powerful argument. The leader of the dictator, the leader of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, has embraced this idea of putting aside political and civil rights in favor of subsistence rights, development rights. But I just want to give you a quick anecdote. I was a foreign correspondent in China at the beginning of 2003, end of 2002, 2003. And our Chinese friends and people in the Chinese media started talking about how there was this, people were getting sick all over southern China. That there was the emergence of this strange illness that was highly contagious and also could be very deadly. Now, this illness did exist. It became known as severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS. By the end of the summer of 2003, it had killed around 700-800 people in China, Singapore, Taiwan, Canada, the United Kingdom. This was an illness that was recognized by the government by the end of 2002, but they covered it up. because it was bad news. And when there's no state, when you have a state media, when you don't have a free media, they can do that. Journalists weren't allowed to talk about this. This was a simple epidemiological issue that could and should have been handled really quickly. Instead, it went loose and killed 800 people. Here's my lesson for that. Human rights human rights problems no longer stop at borders. Okay, that's the other thing. Second example, 2008, the Beijing Olympics. Remember that? China's coming out party. There was, that's what they called it. I know, it sounds funny now. It turned out that there was a company that produced most of the infant formula in China that was, for various reasons of profit maximization, I think is the term, was lacing their formula with something called melamine, which is basically a kind of plastic that also looks like a protein. And it caused the sickness of hundreds of thousands of children in China, killed at least 15, according to state media, and it got sold and poisoned kids all over Asia. Same dynamic. The government knew about it. The Olympics were coming. They clamped down on bad news. People died. So that's my full-throated defense of why civil and political rights and economic and social culture rights need to be absolutely intertwined. You can't pick and choose as you see fit. So that brings us to now, okay? And like my opening, we are in a period when human rights are being openly questioned, that their utility, logic, effectiveness, applicability to current events is being questioned or dismissed outright. The Indian writer Pankaj Mishra has referred to this as the age of anger. I think it's more appropriate to call it the age of fear, when you have developments like technological change, economic inequality, economic insecurity, terrorism, a refugees crisis, the greatest one in a generation. It's caused a lot of fear and insecurity. That fear and insecurity is being tapped by populist leaders who are using this malign form of reasoning that your problems, these problems, are not your problems. It's because of someone else. It's because of a certain group, boiling down complex problems into very simple but brutal and abusive answers. So, who are some of our key people on this? Well, thank you, Johan. Viktor Orban, who is the democratically elected leader of Hungary, is literally walling off Hungary from the Middle East. Okay? There are rights of refuge, there are rights of asylum seekers. Orban is concerned about what he describes as the traditional nature of Hungary, and he doesn't want refugees coming and claiming asylum in defiance of international law. They are the enemy. They are to be kept out. Marine Le Pen, who is now second, she's in the run-up for the election. Okay, she could be the next Prime Minister of France, who has also identified an other that needs to be neutralized in some way. Who are they? Marine Le Pen doesn't really like people who are refugees, immigrants' children. These people are identified as the problem with modern France. And of course, we have this person who I think, are we at day 98 or day 99? It's very auspicious, but his first 99 days, it has been a litany of individuals and groups that need to be kept out, kicked out, dealt with. A whole, what he would describe as a rogues gallery of bad hombres, okay? This is in the news. And he's targeting Latinos, exactly. Drug laws, drug reform has been rolled back. People who use drugs or drug addicts are being targeted. So why is this a problem? I mean, these things happen. You look at history, these things happen. But this type of strain of toxic and skillfully hijacking people's fears and concerns into some toxic targeting of an other has very serious precedents in history. And one of the books out tonight, Hannah Arendt, who wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism, one of the interesting observations she makes is that the road to Auschwitz, the road to the horrors of the Second World War were paved by, number one, a fear and marginalization of refugees. That it was refugees and the ability to stigmatize them, to deprive them of their humanity, which helped to create the catastrophe. And I mean, beautiful language, but she said, you know, in the end, for refugees, the world found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human. The other thing is that she warned that in the not too distant future, based on her lessons of Auschwitz, that it's very possible that, and I quote again, one fine day, a highly organized and mechanized humanity will conclude quite democratically, there's a key word, yeah? That for humanity as a whole, it would be better to liquidate parts of it. Now, that's already happened. And in fact, that's already happening right now. And I want to give you exhibit A for why we should not just be concerned, but we should be scared, and we should be organizing, and we should be preparing. Because in the Philippines, which a country which has made admirable progress from authoritarian rule in the 1980s, is a country with a free press and active civil society, was the first Asian state to abolish the death penalty. This was a country that people would look to a certain, it wasn't problem-free, but people looked to as evidence that societies and politics can evolve and change from brutal roots. It all changed on June 30th, 2016, when a guy by the name of Rodrigo Duterte was elected president. Now, this guy was elected on an explicit platform that the problems of the Philippines were rooted in illegal drug use. He said that the Philippines is in the throes of a narco emergency, and he just made it up. I mean, Joseph Goebbels would have been clapping from his grave. And he promised biblical scale violence if he was elected. He didn't fool anybody. I quote, he said at a mass rally days before he was elected that he would fill Manila Bay with the bodies of thousands of criminal suspects that he would execute, okay? I have criticized President Rodrigo Duterte in public, in the media. He has invited me personally to come to his hometown so I could be publicly executed. This is a person, he's the president of the Philippines. I mean, look, I wanted...
My campaign against drug will not stop until the last pusher and the last drug lord are...
I wasn't making it up, yeah. So, since July 1st, what does that mean? About every day since July 1st, 2016, 40 to 50 people, mostly in Manila, almost 100% from some of the poorest urban slums of Manila, have ended up dead on the streets, shot to death, wrapped in packing tape, stabbed with ice picks, mutilated. This is what this gentleman calls proof of the success of his anti-drug campaign. Members of his government are 100% behind him. More than 7,000 people have been killed. This is a democratically elected government, and he's delivering with a vengeance on his promises. Got to be afraid on these folks. These things. This is a perfect example of how, even for a democratic state with institutions that basically work, can go badly off the rails with the right mixture of populist leader and public discontent. Now. So where does that leave us? I mean, the Philippines is an example. We're not there yet, but we are in a time when we have leaders and individuals and groups who are attempting to provide simple answers to very complex questions by blaming people, by victimizing people. And what I'm saying, and what I said at the beginning, and as this talk was flagged, is that we have a role in this, that we are in this, as this tide moves, you know, we are the resistance, and we have a role to play in stopping this and turning it back. And particularly because we in democratic states who have, for now at least, the right and freedom to speak out, have a particular obligation to speak out for people overseas who can't, but also for teens who are locked up in Rikers Island in isolation, for indigenous peoples who are fighting against unlawful abuses and uses of their land. So I want to leave you here with some hope and a toolkit, an intellectual self-defense kit. The first thing I would say is, what we got to do in dealing with this is, and you remember you have a role, the first thing I would say is come to ThinkOlios, okay? And the reason I say that is this is part of community, okay? Part of community is getting out and being and building community with people who are like-minded or not, who are like you or not, but you come here and you learn together. This is absolutely key, having a community. I mentioned Hannah Arendt, and it's interesting, this book, this wonderful book, don't be intimidated, but I know it's small print and kind of heavy, but in the end, she leaves on a really interesting note. She points out that one of the reasons why these terrible things happened, why Auschwitz happened, why the horrors of the Second World War happened, was she points her finger at something interesting that I wouldn't think of. She points her finger at loneliness, that she points her finger at people who are isolated from their communities and people who were exploited as a result of that isolation. And she has this great quote where she says that people were channeled so that they were able to have these futile feelings of self-importance and hysterical security by authoritarian powers. In this time of social media, when it's so easy to be compartmentalized, to be isolated, it's all the more important to push back at that. The second thing I would say is I'd say read. Thank God you're here. You all read. You read books, but we need to read more and read the paper stuff, And I put out some favorite topics that are related to this, books out there that you can take a look at. Subscribe to credible, reliable, fact-based news organizations, whether it's an online subscription or even better, a print subscription. In this time of alternate facts, this is key to your intellectual self-defense, okay? And the other thing I want to say is, develop a good sense of skepticism, okay, based on fact. Because it's not just pushing back the tide, it's the fact that even despite the threats that I've just talked about, there's still more work to be done. There's no longer a slave market on Wall Street, unless it opened in the last week or so. But there are large numbers of people who still live in slavery in the world. Women in far too many countries of the world are still second or third class citizens. Children still labor in atrocious conditions against all kinds of international laws. I know this sounds like a lot, but I don't think it's a lot. And I just want to put into context, I have the privilege of knowing this man. I don't know if you remember this guy. His name is Chen Guangcheng. He is a Chinese citizen. He's a blind man born into grinding poverty in rural Shandong province, taught himself to be a lawyer, organized and led and sought to represent thousands of women who had been subjected to forced abortions and forced sterilization, spent years in prison, and by 2012, he lived in his rural village, which had been turned unlawfully, illegally, into basically a fortified camp patrolled by security thugs. And this person escaped miraculously. May 2012, he jumped over the wall of his home, evaded all the police. I mean, it was almost like a Marvel comic. He's got heightened senses of hearing. He was able to use touch to get out. He escaped. He made it to the U.S. Embassy. I can't make this up. Maybe you remember this. He got out. He made it to New York. He was a fellow at NYU. And I've had the pleasure of meeting with him to talk about what we can do in terms of human rights in China. And when we talk about various specific issues and general issues, but he always ends by looking at me and saying, what are you doing for people like me? And when he says people like me, he says people have been marginalized, scorned, deprived of rights, unlawfully imprisoned, had their relatives tortured. He says, what are you doing for me? And I'll kind of mumble some, well, we're doing this. And he'll stop me and say, I escaped the Chinese government. I said, you need to do better. You need to do more. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to leave you on an up here with Chen Guangcheng. I want you to say that, I want to assert very, very clearly that the battle for human rights, it is not a lost cause, okay? But guess what? It is not a winning cause either. It is an ongoing cause that requires all of us, all hands to the wheel. And I want to thank you for listening to me, and I want to remind you guys, we are the resistance. Thank you very much. I'll happily take any questions. I'll just take this gentleman here at the front because I saw him first. Yes, sir. Do you want?
So I have a question about the United Nations. In the charter, it says clearly that it's also their goal to uphold power of a sovereign country, and this often is in conflict with protecting human rights. Do you think this is like these two concepts are inherently in conflict, or is there a way to coordinate them?
I would answer that by saying it's been the operating assumption and principle of international human rights movement is that sovereignty is no excuse for abuse of the human rights of one's citizens. Now, the sovereignty issue comes in terms of the ability to intervene to prevent those. And that's why this idea of responsibility to protect, R2P, grew out of the bloodletting of Rwanda in 1994. But yes, that is an obstacle. The UN doesn't have an army, okay? So, preventing and stopping abuses remains problematic. Yeah. Questions? Yeah. Can I pass this? Oh, great. Thank you.
He sort of said what I was going to say, but in a more articulate way, I think, which was that I used to do a bit of work with Amnesty, and we used to be accused of just being a tool of neocolonialism. And I'm wondering how groups like Human Rights Watch would respond to that. I mean, when is it that you would respond to bloodletting to protect those people as opposed to people who think or not think, but want to wear a burqa? Like what is the difference?
Right, okay. So I'll answer that question in two ways. So the first thing is, I'll go with the burqa thing. There's established principle in human rights that cultural traditions stop where they start to interfere or affect or deny people's basic human rights, okay? So there are, for example, in various African and Asian societies, a female genital mutilation is a tradition, okay? That's absolutely unlawful and not allowed under international law. In terms of your second point, or your first point, I should say, in terms of being accused of being a neo-colonialist, the international human rights movement, the UN, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, they get tarred with this all the time. This is the defense of autocrats and dictators who are trying to evade responsibility and accountability. I would put it as simple as that. I haven't heard a cogent argument in which people who have taken that approach have actually tried to break it down. Is that reasonable? Yeah. Woman right next to her, so it's convenient with the microphone.
I'm just interested in your opinion on what do you think is going to happen with the mounting tensions with North Korea?
Okay, kind of stepping out of my terms of reference, and all I would say is if you were listening to the news today, I was really scared. If you have the President of the United States saying that there is a great chance of a conflict with North Korea, that's extremely worrying. In terms of where I come from this, from a human rights activist and researcher, North Korea is a disaster. North Korea is a human rights disaster, and it has been for decades. But I can say one thing, and when we talk about these things like how the community, the human rights community responds through the interventions and advocacy and lobbying of people, of organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, et cetera, there has been a commission of inquiry launched by the UN into human rights abuses in North Korea, and it made clear that the leaders were liable to prosecution for these abuses in black and white. It let them know you're on notice that you're going to end up in a court unless someday, and you should stop sooner than later. Does that help you? Yeah. Hi, this woman here in the corner, I think she was before me. Here, I'll just...
So I have two questions. The first one is about how do you overcome the fact that national security has now become normalized and accepted as a justification for any kinds of disregard for human rights? And the other part is, I grew up in Hong Kong, and I'm wondering what you think about the future of Hong Kong, especially given the fact that despite China's increasing encroachments upon Hong Kong's the liberties and freedoms that they've enjoyed for so long, despite that encroachment, there has been little attention, well, not attention, but there's been little reaction by the international community, even the UK, who for so long played such a significant role in Hong Kong.
What was your first question again?
About national security.
Okay, great. Yeah, so the first question is a great question, and I'll answer it this way. Last year, March of 2016, there was a very, very influential, very credible survey of American attitudes toward torture. You want to guess percentage of Americans who think that torture is justified? Any ideas? 70, 40, it's in the middle. 63% of Americans polled said that torture of terror suspects was sometimes or often justified. Only 15% said it was never justified. I'll answer that another way. When I mentioned this guy, the guy from the Philippines, this guy, he is incredibly popular. He has 70 to 80% popularity ratings, despite the fact that every day 40 to 50 people end up dead and mutilated on the streets of Manila. So it tells us something about, in terms of your question, national security and how people respond to that. And I would say that popularity or support for abusive measures are no excuse for legitimacy. Popularity doesn't mean legitimacy. Governments are bound by this package of treaties and rules and regulations to not abuse the rights of their citizens. Doesn't matter what the justification is. So, and the second question, Hong Kong, I used to live in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's problem and Taiwan's problem is the China problem. And basically what we've seen over the last 20 years, China's meteoric economic rise, is that governments will no longer openly and robustly challenge human rights abuses in China or by China, because the stakes are too high in terms of economic trade deals. That's what it boils down to. So, what we see in Hong Kong is this admirable resistance of people organizing against what they see as the depredations of an authoritarian state. But they are getting, as you can see, they are getting precious little support from the international community. And that's unfortunately likely not to change anytime soon. Yeah. Yes, ma'am, right here. And then you guys, okay, last question, sorry. Last question.
I was wondering, I know you briefly mentioned the death penalty, and I was wondering your thoughts on the status of the death penalty in the U.S. I know this week it's been in the news a lot because of all these executions happening in Arkansas. Like, personally, I've done some research on what leads individuals to support the death penalty, but I know the U.S. is kind of the U.S. and Japan are kind of alone in terms of westernized nations that accept the death penalty. What do you think it would take the U.S. to ever change this policy, or why do you think the U.S. is so exceptional in terms of its support of the death penalty?
Thank you so much. So under international law, and the United Nations has decreed that the death penalty is okay under international law, but only, quote unquote, for the most serious crimes. And those crimes have to be directly related to the death of an individual. So drug crimes generally should not be eligible for execution, death penalty anywhere. In terms of your specific questions about the U.S., I'm not a U.S. citizen. I haven't lived here that long, but I can give you a tip that over on this side, there's a woman who I'll point to later. She is the U.S. She's the co-director of the U.S. program at Human Rights Watch. So she deals with death penalty, drones, drugs, all day, every day, and she'd be happy to answer your questions. All right, I'm going to pass this over to the guys. You got to end it.
Thank you, Phelim. That was amazing.